Today I'm going to tell the story of a little 4-year-old boy who would throw up from fear whenever he saw his stepfather. A story that makes anyone with a bit of empathy for people feel sick to their stomach, even more so when faced with such cowardice. This is the story of a boy who died at home in the early hours of March 2021 in a luxury apartment in Rio de Janeiro. And I especially want to share with you the updates, the details of how, 5 years later, the two people accused of this child's death still haven't been tried. If we treat absurdities like this as mere bureaucracy, we're heading quickly toward the edge, and that's not what it's about. This episode isn't just about the crime, okay? It's about everything that came after. The maneuvers, the appeals, the plot twists, the outrage, the system, and where we are now. So stay with me until the end because the last chapters of this story are the most absurd. But I'm going to go through the entire timeline with you from when it happened to the latest updates. I'm Marcos Campos. Welcome, everyone. Every week there are episodes of real crimes and real stories here. If you like that, follow me here. Leave a like, a comment, even if it's just an emoji. If you can, become a member because it helps me directly with the production of exclusive episodes. Announcements made. Let's get to the facts. Before talking about the crime, I need to tell you a little bit about Henry. Henry Borel Medeiros was born on May 3, 2016 in Rio de Janeiro. He was the son of Monique Medeiros, a teacher, and also of Leniel Borel, an engineer. The two separated in 2020 after years together. Henry continued living with his mother, but he visited his father frequently. Everything was normal. From what the testimonies show us, Henry was an absolutely healthy child. He went to school, played, did his activities, extracurricular ones, right? And what is reported is that since February 2021, the little boy had been seeing a psychologist who was supposedly called by Monique because Henry was refusing to stay at home in the apartment. But at the time, no one really knew the reason for this behavior. And that's where the second main character in this story comes in, Dr. Jairinho Jairo Souza Santos Jr., a doctor, city councilman of Rio de Janeiro, and son of former State Deputy Colonel Jairo. A traditional and very powerful family from the west zone of Rio, Monique met Jairinho in August 2020. In November of that same year, she had already moved in with him. 3 months into their relationship, and she was already living in his apartment in Barra da Tijuca. And of course, she brought her son with her, Henry. What nobody knew yet, or at least nobody reported, is that, according to the investigation, it was exactly in that apartment where the nightmare in this child's life began. The night of the crime was the first weekend of March 2021. Daniel, the father, picked up Henry so they could spend some time together as they always did. Then the two of them went to an amusement park. And on Sunday, March 7th, around 7:20 post-meridium Leniel returned his son to Monique, his ex-wife, according to Monique's initial statement. She gave Henry a bath, then put the little boy to bed, and everything was fine. In the early hours of the 8th, she wakes up to the sound of the television, goes to her son's room, and finds Henry lying on the floor, with cold hands and feet and his eyes rolled back. She then calls Dr. Jairinho. He wraps the child in a blanket and the two of them go down the building's elevator. There, with Henry in his arms, the elevator cameras recorded everything. And when they arrived at the hospital, Henry was already lifeless. Important note here, okay? I summarized the script to focus on the final part of the trial, which, didn't happen, but take a look at this part about the arrival at the hospital. It's exactly this ambiguity and understanding that the defense of the accused relies on as well, okay? So I want to explain this point in more detail here. Take a look. So, Henry was admitted to the hospital at Barrador around 3:50 in the morning in cardiorespiratory arrest, but showing jaw stiffness, cyanosis, paleness, cold extremities, and no central or peripheral pulses. Look, in other words, he did arrive there in cardiac arrest, yes, but the hospital documented something fundamental, the jaw stiffness. It was already a forensic medical sign of certainty of death, which indicates that the cardiorespiratory arrest had occurred sometime before arriving at the hospital. So, the team performed resuscitation maneuvers for 60 minutes without any response, and death was then declared at around 5:40. And that's why I mentioned that Jaron's defense, for example, used exactly this point. That's when Henry arrived in cardiac arrest. Resuscitation maneuvers were performed, and therefore, as a result of this, these liver lacerations could have been caused. But the Door Network, where the hospital sent an official letter to the court, categorically refuted this, stating that it is not possible to link Henry's death to the actions taken by the medical team. Yes, that observation was made. I thought it was important. We followed the couple's version, mainly a domestic accident. Henry supposedly fell out of bed while he was sleeping. I guess his bed must have been about 30 meters high, right? The medical examiner's office disproved that version piece by piece, okay? The autopsy report indicated that Henry suffered 23 injuries caused by violent action, including liver lacerations and internal bleeding. He must have hit things during the 30-meter fall from the bed to the floor, right? Look at what people were going to say to you, man. 23 injuries caused by violent action, right? Including liver lacerations, like I said, and internal bleeding. All of that, guys, in a 4-year-old child. Completely defenseless. That's not from falling out of bed. Of course it's not. I'm being ironic here because it really hits us to the core. This is totally incompatible with any domestic accident. Don't you think so? And I'm saying this based on what's reported in the official reports. A supplementary forensic analysis with 3D reconstruction reinforced the conclusion that the death resulted from physical violence, completely ruling out any possibility of an accident. But the investigation went deeper, and what the police found on the cell phones was what changed the course of things. What did the messages reveal? When the police seized the couple's cell phones, Monique and Jair, they found conversations that put Monique in a very hard position to defend. The revealed messages showed that there were frequent assaults against Henry and that Monique did not keep her son away from the aggressor. The boy's nanny reportedly warned Monique in writing, describing what Jairzinho did to Henry when she wasn't there. And Monique apparently did nothing and stayed quiet. According to the public prosecutor's office, what happened in the early hours of the 8th was not an isolated incident. There were at least 3 occasions throughout February 2021. Jairzinho allegedly subjected Henry to physical and mental suffering, using violence 3 times just in February, and Henry died in March. Henry's father, Borel, gave a statement that stayed in the memory of the entire country. He said that when Henry saw Jairzinho, he would vomit out of fear and his son would become desperate in complete panic. Just imagine, right? A 4-year-old child who vomits out of fear when he sees his stepfather. And look, guys, this reminded me of something. Of course, this is just a starting point, just for reasoning, okay? I have a 4-year-old daughter and one of her classmates from school. When classes started again at the beginning of the year, she started feeling sick all the time. She was always nauseous, right? She kept feeling really, really bad. The parents didn't know what it was until they changed the child to a different classroom, and in the blink of an eye, she got better. Because she developed a feeling of panic towards the teacher. I don't know, something that was happening in that classroom. When she changed teachers, the problem was gone. So it made me, when I was writing this script for you, I immediately remembered that. You can imagine, right? A child who goes into shock, into terror when they see an adult they are forced to live with, because the poor kid didn't have a choice, right? Well, it just made me remember that, yeah, let's move on to the accusations. Monique and Jairzinho were charged with triple qualified homicide, and after more detailed investigations began, also with torture, coercion during the process, and procedural fraud. Jairzinho as the direct perpetrator of the crime, Monique as an accomplice by omission, right? Because from everything that was reported, she knew, she was warned, and apparently she did nothing to protect her son. There's also the thought that maybe I don't know too. The prosecutor in the case was straightforward. There is no doubt whatsoever that Jairo cruelly tortured Henri Borel. This crime happened because Monique Medeiros gave up her sacred duty to protect her son. The case, of course, caused a national outcry on a level that Brazil hadn't seen since the Isabella Nardone case in 2008. And it led to a law, including the Henri Borel law, which brought stricter punishment for crimes against children under 14 years old, and specific protective measures for victims of domestic violence. Henry's name became law, as we saw, but those responsible for his death would still take a long time to face trial. 5 years of maneuvers. From here on, the story picks up a pace that will leave you, honestly, with a strange feeling. Because what happened between 2021 and 26 our year is a marathon of habeas corpus appeals, procedural shenanigans, postponements, etc., 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 etc. That system that exists to cover its own back, you know how it works, right? I'll summarize the main points here. Okay, 2021 arrested, charged by the public prosecutor's office, the trial begins. Yeah, everyone is anxious for the verdict. 2022, Monique gets provisional release by decision of the Rio court. She'll be free for a few months. 2023, the Supreme Court minister orders Monique to return to prison with the understanding there was a risk of obstruction of justice, so she goes back to being imprisoned during this period. Then, actually, it's not all. Jairzinho's defense filed appeal after appeal. Requests for habeas corpus denied, attempts to contest reports, questions about the chain of custody of the evidence, requests for nullification. And the list is pretty long, okay? Jairzinho, he also faced repercussions beyond the criminal case. CREMERGE, which is the medical council in Rio, permanently revoked his medical license. He also lost his position as a city councilman for breach of parliamentary decorum. His defense appealed the loss of his mandate and also lost in November 2025. After more than 4 years of the process, the trial date was finally set for March 23, 2026. Henry's father reacted emotionally on social media about this. In his words, Henry only lived for 4 years. For more than 4 years, I have woken up and gone to sleep with the same request, that the truth about what they did to my little son be told before all of society. Seeing the trial date set is like reopening a wound that never healed. It hurts a lot, but it also gives me hope that finally Henry will be heard by justice. It gives you chills, doesn't it? But now it almost makes your stomach tie in knots, reading all this emotion here, and knowing what's coming next. The defense's thesis. Before I talk about March 23rd, I need to explain something to you, okay? It's really important. What Jairzinho's defense argues, because it's not just stalling for the sake of stalling. You'll see, there's a thesis there. The defense claims that the forensic reports were manipulated, that there was external interference in the construction of the evidence. The team of lawyers claims to have obtained messages extracted from cell phones using an Israeli software called Celebrite, which would show that the expert responsible for the reports talked to the head of the Rio de Janeiro Instituto Médico Legal before finalizing one of the documents for the defense, and this conversation led to a change in the report to favor the prosecution. In the words of lawyer Rodrigo Fox, the content of the messages proves without any doubt that the autopsy reports were manipulated in the interest of third parties. Well, the defense also brought up a very old theory that Henry could have died, not from the assaults but from the resuscitation maneuvers performed at Barrador Hospital. And they even made an argument that had an impact. We're saying that the child was proven not to be a victim of assaults. Look, the public prosecutor's office counters all of this with physical evidence, okay? 23 injuries, internal bleeding, 3D report. The prosecution says the evidence is irrefutable, but the defense's strategy works if they can plant some doubt in the jurors' minds. And that's exactly why access to the evidence has become the central battleground in this case. March 23, 2026. So now we've arrived at a recent date, March 23, 2026. 5 years after the crime, the whole country was watching the second trial, the jury trial in Rio de Janeiro. Leniel Borel arrived early at the courthouse, spoke to the journalists at the entrance, and said the following: "What happened to my son in that apartment?" Inside the courtroom, Judge Elizabeth Machado Luro had selected the jury, made up of 6 women and 1 man. Then she began reading the indictment. Everything was ready. The jurors were chosen, prosecutors, defense, prosecution, cameras, the victim's father in the audience. Then Jairzinho's defense asked to speak, requesting a postponement of the trial, arguing that they did not have full access to the evidence. They said they had requested these documents since August 2025 and had only received partial information. The judge denied the request. Then Jairino's 5 defense attorneys stood up and announced that they were leaving the courtroom. This is not just a dramatic scene, it has a very concrete legal consequence. A defendant cannot be left without legal representation during the trial. If the defense leaves, the trial trava. Ponto. The judge asked if they were sure. They said yes, confirmed it, and left. Then the jurors were dismissed and the session was ended. 5 years waiting, and the trial didn't even get to the first testimony. And about all of this, Judge Elizabeth swallowed hard. Right there, you know. She recorded in the minutes the official classification of the conduct, an improper interruption of the procedural appeal, in clear disrespect to the guidance from the Supreme Federal Court. And she went further. I believe that the conduct of the lawyers, even if motivated by dissatisfaction, fits much more with what is considered procedural abandonment. I declare it as an act offensive to the dignity of justice. As a sanction, she ordered the 5 lawyers present to reimburse all the operational costs of the trial. Frustrated. Travel expenses for staff, accommodation for the jurors, food for everyone involved, and security expenses. In addition, she referred the case to the Bar Association for investigation of ethical and disciplinary sanctions against the lawyers and took a measure to try to prevent the same maneuver from happening again. She appointed the public defender's office to represent Jairino, ensuring that the defendant would never be without representation, which would eliminate the legal argument used to stall the trial. That's how it works. Man, it's almost like Black Mirror, you know, that series, at least I think so. Let me know in the comments. But after all that, as if it wasn't enough, there's one more consequence, you know, that blew up on social media. Monique says, with the trial postponed, the judge found herself facing a real legal problem. Monique had been in pretrial detention since 2021 with a brief interruption in 2022, as we saw. The postponement of the trial, then, caused by Jairino's defense, would further extend this period of detention. And the law states that no one can be kept in pretrial detention for an indefinite period. Monique's defense was, ironically, against the postponement. They wanted the trial to happen, but with the new date set for May, the judge understood that keeping Monique in custody would be unlawful coercion and said, due to the clearly unreasonable excess of the detention period, I release Monique Medeiros and order her immediate release. De Alvarez. Release order. In simple terms, the woman has been in jail for a long time. Let her go. On the same night, Monique left the La Vera Bruce Penal Institute in Bangu. Meanwhile, Jairino remained in custody. Pretrial detention is analyzed individually for each defendant, okay? And the reasons to keep him in custody still held up. The reaction in Brazil, I don't even need to tell you, was once again one of shock, right? A case that repeats itself day after day, that makes us anxious, leaves our stomachs churning, upset day after day. Man, it's like this. I put myself in the shoes of that father, of the family members, you know? It's something like that, an endless, excruciating pain. What Lineal Borel said publicly was, they murdered my son for the 2nd time. That's exactly what I was saying to you guys, right? The following days happened in quick succession. On Tuesday, March 24th, the public prosecutor's office filed an appeal requesting Monique's imprisonment to be reinstated, arguing that there was no delay in the conduct of the process that would justify the relaxation of custody. Since the grounds for preventive detention remained valid, the public prosecutor's office said that the maneuver by Jairino's defense, was illegal and that Monique should not benefit from it. On Wednesday, March 25th, the Rio City Hall fired Monique from her position as a municipal teacher. Her defense said they will appeal. Meanwhile, the Bar Association confirmed that it will open an investigation into the conduct of Jairino's lawyers. And the new trial date has been set, confirmed for May 25th, 2026. Initially, the judge had considered June, but realized that the date would fall in the middle of the World Cup, which could affect the availability of the jurors, so she moved it up to May. Man, it's just surreal, really surreal. This is just a mockery of the soul of that poor kid, you know. That's what it is to me, that's what it is. Comment on that here for me, because come on, for God's sake, let's get outraged together, because this is just too much. Well, the question everyone asks in the face of all this is whether this trial will actually happen this time. On Jairino's defense side, the strategy is different now, with the public defender's office appointed as backup. Let's say the maneuver of abandoning the courtroom becomes more difficult, right? Because even if the private lawyers leave, the state is there to guarantee the defendant's representation. But the defense can also go to the Supreme Court before May, trying to annul evidence, contest the legitimacy of the reports, or request another measure that delays the process. On the public prosecutor's side, the appeal against Monique's release can still be judged before May, okay? And if the Court of Justice in Rio or the Supreme Court sides with the public prosecutor, Monique goes back to jail before the trial. This is a trial that will last for days. Testimonies from 26 witnesses and interrogations of the defendants for both defense and prosecution are scheduled. Putting together a jury that can be available for all of this in a case with extremely high media exposure is not simple. Let's be honest, it's not. The prosecution says the evidence is overwhelming. 23 injuries, messages from the nanny, 3D reconstruction, the history of assaults in February, the elevator camera showing the boy already lifeless. It's all in these people's hands. Then, the defense bets on the theory of manipulated reports and reasonable doubt. In the end, the decision is made by 7 ordinary people, the famous jury. But do you know what really matters in this whole story? Henry was only 4 years old. He didn't choose where to live. Like I said, he didn't choose who he was or who the adults responsible for him were. He relied entirely on those meant to protect him. Lionel Borel, the father, became the public voice of this case. Then 5 years ago, he said a sentence that sums it all up. Maybe Henry only lived for 4 years. I've already spent more time in mourning than I had with my son. Please consider that for a moment. Meanwhile, the Brazilian legal system kept working the way it does, with its guarantees, its appeals, its deadlines, and its limits. There are people who defend every step of this process as necessary for a state governed by the rule of law to function. That criticism even has some basis, but there's also a dead child, right? With 23 injuries on the body. And 2 people who should be held accountable for this are still waiting to find out the result of the trial. Brazil created the Henry Borel law. His name is on legislation that tries to protect other children, but justice for Henry himself still hasn't come, ironically. May 25, 2026 is the next date, and I'm sure the whole country will be watching. Thanks for your company. A kiss from the redhead. See you next episode.